Councilmember Adam Gazaldua, Congresswoman Crockett, Sheriff Brown, Commissioner Maples, and if there's any other elected or appointed officials, please stand and be recognized. Thank you. I appreciate your support and your commitment today and for the past 2 weeks on behalf of the Santos family. We are joined today by David's wife, Daphne. Thank you. By now, my hope is that you all have shared and listened to the story of Santos Rodriguez, a 13-year-old boy that was tragically murdered 50 years ago. He was pulled from his home unlawfully in the midst of the night by a Dallas police officer. While he resided in his home with his grandfather, who was unaware of the laws or his rights. Moments later, that officer took that young boy into a squad car to try to get a confession out of him. Santos and his brother kept their story, saying that they were innocent, or they were accused of stealing from a vending machine at a convenience store. The officer tried to get a confession out of Santos. He then played a deadly game of Russian roulette with Santos, which resulted in his tragic death. From there, caused riots and uprising in the Mexican-American community here in Dallas and abroad. I'm thankful for their journey, as today I stand on the shoulders of giants like Benjamin and others. It's because of their movement that I stand before you today. Over the past few years, Dallas has finally acknowledged its wrongs by publicly apologizing to Santos and his family, working to rename the recreation center at Pike Park in honor of Santos, and a statue in his likeness now resides there. We've worked on the police oversight board and other policies, but there's still much work to be done. My hope is that with your help, we are able to renovate the Santos Rodriguez Recreation Center with the upcoming 2024 bond program. Yeah. Today, we conclude 2 weeks worth of events acknowledging the 50th anniversary of Santos, of the death of Santos. I'm joined by my own Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, who has a special presentation today. Congresswoman Crockett.
Well, good evening to each of you, and thank you so much for being here. You know, many people don't know my full journey, and a lot of people don't know how I first became familiar with this story. Some of you may be surprised that 50 years ago I was not on this earth just yet. So I didn't grow up knowing the story. But what I did do is, as a civil rights lawyer in the city of Dallas, I represented a 15-year-old by the name of Jordan Edwards. Jordan Edwards had been killed by law enforcement. And the case shook me to my core. And it was so interesting that some of the first people that came out to support the movement and making sure that we raised awareness about Jordan Edwards were people from the Mexican-American community. They wanted to make sure that I knew the history of things that had taken place in the city of Dallas. They told me about Santos Rodriguez. They told me the story of the officer who had been convicted almost 50 years ago at that point in time and given a minimum of 5 years in prison for murder. And so as I listened to the story, the sad part about the story was that there have been other people that have been killed by Dallas police after Santos and been convicted for doing so. And so I was committed to fight for yet another child who had been killed unlawfully, in my opinion. And so I can remember protesting, marching, walking, and spreading the story of Jordan. And And I remember going to the park for the renaming. I remember being there for all of that. And to be clear, at that point in time, I wasn't an elected official. But my work is what led me to decide that I had to go in to do something bigger. I had to change the laws because it didn't make sense to me how that could happen so long ago. And while there was a conviction, the minimum for a child, and we're not talking about an accident, we're talking about something that was very intentional. And then sitting on pins and needles and waiting to see if a jury would convict for the death of Jordan Edwards. And ultimately, that jury did convict. It was the first conviction of murder on duty in Dallas County since Santos. And so the Santos story is so personal to me. And the reason that I tell you about my experience as a civil rights lawyer and Jordan's story is because I want you to understand this has never been a fight that's only been for Mexican Americans. And it's not a fight that's only been for Black Americans. It is all of our fights. And so recognizing the tragedy of this story in 50 years since it happened, now sitting as a U.S. Congresswoman, I had an obligation to make sure that we recognize this history. And we're recognizing this history in a time in which a lot of people don't want us to remember our history. We're recognizing this history so we don't repeat it. Just like I didn't learn this story until Jordan, I think it's important that we make sure we tell these stories. Not because we want to beat anybody up, but because number one, we want to celebrate his short-lived life. And secondly, we want to make sure that we do not repeat such horrific things ever again. And so with that, you got a little glimpse of the story for those of you that don't know it from our councilman. And I must say, I love this guy. Councilman Moreno has always been on the forefront. Before he was elected, we were working together, as well as Adam Bass. These are my friends, these are my brothers, these are my partners in crime. And so with that, I want to make sure while we do not have David here today, we have his beautiful wife. And so I'm going to make two presentations. One is a congressional record, and each of you on your seat should have a copy of that congressional record. I will not bore you by reading it, but just so you know, forever in the United States House, they will know the name, the life, and the tragic death of Santos Rodriguez. In addition to that, July 24th, which was 50 years later, the flag that was flown at the U.S. Capitol. I'm now going to make sure that my team has you. We're going to present that to you as well. So I was asking her if she wanted to stay with me workers. This is tough, especially as someone who left home she loved. I loved being in the courtroom. I miss it. But if I can save a life by making sure that legislation is written to make sure that we don't ever have to go through another 50-year remembrance, then it all would have been worth it. And so that is what I'm committing myself to doing, is fighting and coming up with people-centered policies. Policies that don't work for just a select few, but work for all of us. And hopefully creating an environment to where we celebrate our diversity. And I'm emotional because today is such a bad day in the state of Texas. As we saw that there were 2 lives that were lost in the Rio Grande. You've got to do better. And every day in DC, when you don't see me, trust and believe, I am fighting for a better, more united States of America. Thank you.
I'd like to invite members of the Santos Rodriguez Coalition to please join me up here. George, Albert. Santos Rodriguez Coalition. There's many more of us that are not here today. Thank you, Congresswoman Crockett, for taking to heart the epic tragedy of Santos Rodriguez and adding it to the Commemoration record. Indeed, Santos belongs to the ages. A couple of quick updates. Next month, 10 PBS stations across Texas will broadcast the film Santos Rodriguez that was produced by our very own Mr. Byron Hunter. And please continue to pray for Bessie Rodriguez, who, as many of you know, is still hospitalized. The Santos Rodriguez 50 Coalition, working with the Office of Councilman Jesse Moreno, the extraordinary Councilman Jesse Moreno, produced multiple public events to honor the memory of Santos Rodriguez. I think we produced like 14 events in 12 days. It was a whirlwind. There's a few highlights for me personally. Other people might have their own highlights, but because I've got the microphone, I can share my highlights. Mr. Moreno's staff organized an art and essay competition among the youth, kind of like reminded me of the one that you organized a few months ago. What the children produced was eye-popping, as it was provocative. It's just absolutely stunning to view the story of Santos Rodriguez through the eyes of these young people. And poet laureate Joaquin Ceballos' poem poignantly brought forth what had lain buried in the hearts of Dallas Latinos for decades. I recommend to you, if you haven't read that poem, please find it. It's available on Santos Rodriguez. You can go to our Facebook page. And lastly, a Latino podcaster attending a memorial that was held in Hyde Park on Sunday, July 23rd, said in his podcast he was taken aback when Frances Riesel, our dear sister Frances Riesel, a Dallas icon, she's got a park named after her in West Dallas, took the microphone and said, "They wanted me to keep this positive." He thought to himself, how can one find anything positive in this story when everything about it is heartbreaking, gut-wrenching, and wrong? What hope? Where? As he looks around at the people gathered at the park, he muses in his mind that 15,000 Latinos lived in Little Mexico in 1930, but more than 550,000 call Dallas home now. When his gaze falls on the statue of Santos Rodriguez in Hyde Park, he finds in Santos's smiling face and outstretched arms inspiration and hope. As he imagines Santos saying, quote, "My dreams were snuffed out. Our thriving neighborhood of Little Mexico was destroyed. But guess what? I'm still here. We are still here. I'm standing here in Hyde Park, and my beloved community is still with me." Santos' story is as much about respect for human dignity and rights as it is about a resilient community. A community that richly deserves honor and respect for his contributions to American society, but also for the sacrifices it has had to make. So I say Santos vive, you say vive. Santos vive.
Vive.
Santos vive.
Vive.
Santos vive.
Vive.
Santos vive.
Vive.
Santos vive.
Vive.
Thank you. Thank you, Congressman.
We're done. 18